So when Spider-Man 3 ended up messier than anticipated, Sony thought their best option was a reboot in the form of the Amazing Spider-Man movies. As you probably know, these movies ended up getting bogged down by a convoluted plot and the obsessive need to set up their own shared universe to catch up with Marvel. So when Amazing Spider-Man 2 didn't perform as well as Sony hoped, it was over to Marvel Studios for a partnership that allowed the webhead and certain villains to appear in the MCU, while Sony still held the rights to the character and his villains. Thankfully, on the Marvel Studios side, the partnership has been pretty beneficial, especially considering the fact that No Way Home was truly amazing and something that neatly tied all those copyright battles and reboots together. But there's one thing that Sony never let go of, and that was the need to catch up to Marvel by having a team-up movie of their own, in the form of Spidey's deadliest team of foes, the Sinister Six. Sony has been planning this ensemble film way back since 2012 and basically turned The Amazing Spider-Man 2 into a Sinister Six commercial with all the teases and world building it did to set that team up in that movie. Even when plans for the rest of that franchise fell through, Sony was still talking about that film. Clearly, they still want to move forward with it, considering we now have 2 Spider-Man-less Venom films, a movie coming about Kraven the Hunter, and what we're here to talk about today, Morbius. The latest attempt by Sony to continue their universe of Spider-Man characters without actually having Spider-Man in it. Does it work? Does Michael Morbius, the living vampire, stand on his own without a Spider-Man to battle? Well, no, not really. That's it. Review over. You can go home now. Seriously though, outside of a couple of well-done scenes in the first act, Morbius is an absolute mess with a jumbled plot, paper-thin characters, cheesy and unfunny dialogue, derivative action scenes, obvious plot reveals and twists, bland cinematography and bad editing, bad acting, and, of course, terrible CGI. Oh my god, the CGI was so bad. But I'll get to that later. Let's start with the story. Hardly anything makes sense or meshes together well in this film. The opening scene shows Morbius with a team in Costa Rica doing something with bats. We don't know because it's never really explained and it never gets brought up again. From there, the narrative only gets more and more confusing. We jump from this random scene in the present to a flashback of Morbius' childhood as a crippled child in a special care facility. These scenes serve to set up his relationship with the film's villain, Shocker, another origin story with a villain that's basically a carbon copy of the hero, and explain his quest to cure their shared disease, a disease that's never really explained or given a basis in reality and doesn't really make any sense. From there, I will admit there is a bit of a glimmer of hope. The first act scenes of Michael Morbius researching and testing different cures for his disease are interesting and provide a strong goal for his character. And when we get to that scene in the trailer of his first transformation on the boat, I actually started to get invested and enjoy myself a little bit. Terrible CG aside, when Morbius fully transforms and lets loose on the crew of the boat, who are, of course, evil douche mercenaries just to make sure that our anti-hero isn't too unrelatable, it's actually pretty awesome. They touch into horror a little bit and even show enough vampire violence to keep it scary while staying in PG-13 territory. But the film takes a bit of a nosedive from there. After a surprisingly boring way of discovering and testing his powers, seriously, you just hang out in a lab the entire time? The plot basically becomes nonsensical. Between a villain that barely has a shred of motivation and pops up completely out of nowhere, a completely half-assed explanation of where Morbius' powers come from, how they work, and what the actual rules are, a finale that's rushed and filled with absolutely awful CGI, Morbius really is just a mess that never comes together. That's not all though. Like I mentioned before, character motivations are very thin, especially from the lead, who is supposed to be the one we root for even if the rest of the cast is shit. Jared Leto's Michael Morbius only has one defining characteristic in the beginning, his quest to cure his disease. From there, his goal shifts to keep himself from drinking human blood again. Then, it's to stop the random villain that came in out of nowhere. He never feels like a genuine person. He speaks in one-liners and generic scientific mumbo-jumbo that hold about as much weight as the rest of the film. He lazily stumbles through scenes and delivers dialogue in a stifled, boring way. He has no chemistry with any of the cast. This also isn't helped by his in-movie relationship with his girlfriend, white science partner, I guess? I don't know. They don't really explain it that well either. Adria Arjona's Martine Bancroft has no development or motivation whatsoever and is just there to support Morbius' experiments and eventually be a damsel in distress. Tyrese Gibson and Al Madrigal also have no reason being there. They're just there to follow the violence, look confused at crime scenes, shout vague threats at Morbius, and in the case of Al Madrigal, deliver so many terrible one-liners and jokes that I rolled my eyes every time he came on screen. Tyrese also apparently has powers too, considering he magically runs up 10 flights of stairs within like 5 seconds at one point in the film. Oh, and Jared Harris is also in this movie. That brings us to Matt Smith. In the beginning, he was actually a bit of a compelling character, dealing with the same disease as Morbius and feeling betrayed when Morbius refuses to turn him into a vampire to help him. The film treats his turn as a villain as a big reveal, but the trailers showed it, so here we go, let's talk about it. In Last Night in Soho, Matt Smith was charming and funny, until his true motivations are revealed and his performance turns sinister and sleazy. He does an amazing job in that film. When it comes to this movie, however, it's a different story. Just like Morbius, Matt Smith's Milo's only real motivation is curing himself. And when he does, his character does a complete 180 and he turns from a fragile, bullied man into a murderous psycho that chews the scenery every time he's on screen. All of this builds to a cookie-cutter, anticlimactic finale filled with some of the most atrocious CGI I've seen since 2017's Justice League. It literally looks like it came out of a PS3 video game. And then the movie just kinda ends. But not without two of the worst credit scenes I've ever witnessed that completely toss all lore and logic right out the window. Ultimately, this movie is a lazy, uninspired mess of dull filmmaking, choppy editing, sloppy writing, and convoluted storytelling that exists just to push Sony's stupid and ill-advised Spider-Man adjacent universe. This movie exists just to keep a franchise going that is barely even established and is 100% piggybacking off the MCU. Can't wait for Kraven the Hunter!